So today, we're diving into a really fascinating Supreme Court case. It gets at a huge question. Can a president, in the middle of a crisis, just decide to bypass Congress and slap massive new taxes on the whole country? This is the story of the president versus the power of the purse. And yeah, that's the exact question that landed right in the Supreme Court's lap. I mean, can the executive branch, all on its own, create these huge tariffs, which, let's be real, are taxes, on billions of dollars worth of stuff, cutting Congress out of the picture completely? So here's how it all went down. Right after the 2025 inauguration, the president declared a couple of national emergencies, citing drug trafficking and trade deficits as, quote, unusual and extraordinary threats. He took a pretty dramatic step. He unilaterally imposed a whole new set of sweeping tariffs. And listen, we're not talking about some tiny little tweak here. These new duties hit a staggering 25% on most goods, coming in from Canada and Mexico, plus a bunch of other big tariffs on imports from all over the world. The economic shockwaves were felt almost immediately. Now, you might be wondering, how could a president even do that? Well, the administration didn't just claim they had the power out of thin air. They pointed to a specific law from 1977 called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. The argument was that this law gave the president the authority he needed in a national emergency. And that right there set up the central legal battle. The case wasn't really about whether the emergencies were legit. It was about what this nearly 50-year-old law actually allows a president to do. And what's wild is that the entire massive showdown boiled down to the meaning of a single word. On one side, you had the president's lawyers. They argue that the law's power to regulate importation was this huge, sweeping authority, totally broad enough to include creating tariffs during an emergency. But on the other side, you had everyone from small business owners to a bunch of states. And they had a really simple counterargument. Regulate does not mean tax. The power to tax, they said, belongs to Congress and Congress alone, and you just can't find it in this law. So, this whole fight over one word forces us to take a step back and look at something way bigger, a foundational principle of American government. Who controls the money? It's this bedrock idea called the power of the purse. And you know, the Constitution is incredibly clear about this. The very first power it gives to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, is the power to tax. It's the legislative branch, not the president, that gets the authority to raise money for the government. And this was totally on purpose. The people who wrote the Constitution, remember, had just fought a revolution over taxation without representation. So they deliberately put the power to tax in the hands of the branch that's most directly accountable to the voters. As James Madison put it, Congress alone has access to the people's pockets. They even baked this idea right into the process. Think about how it works. Any bill for raising money has to start in the House of Representatives. Then it has to be passed by all of Congress. The president is intentionally left out of creating the tax. He just gets to sign or veto it at the very end. So you've got the text of this emergency law on one side and this giant constitutional principle on the other. How did the Supreme Court settle it? Well, the justices handed down a verdict that was remarkably clear and decisive. In a 6-3 decision, the court's answer was a big no. They held that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not, in fact, authorize the president to impose tariffs, period. The president's actions were ruled unlawful. But knowing what the court decided is only half the story. The really interesting part is why. So let's unpack the majority's logic here, because it tells you a whole lot about the limits of power in America today. The court's reasoning really hung on this legal idea called the major questions doctrine. Now, it sounds complicated, but the concept is actually pretty simple. Think of it like this. If you ask your neighbor to water your plants while you're on vacation, you've given them power to regulate your plants, but you wouldn't expect them to have the authority to, say, sell your house, right? For that, they'd need your crystal clear, explicit permission. The court says the same thing applies here. For something this huge, the president can't rely on vague language. He needs a really clear green light from Congress. And was this a major question? Oh yeah, absolutely. The government itself estimated that these tariffs would cut the national deficit by a mind-blowing $4 trillion. A policy change that massive, the court said, is definitely a sell the house kind of decision that needs super clear authorization. The justices also looked back at the history of this law. IEPA has been on the books since 1977, and over the decades, it's been used for things like sanctions during the Iran hostage crisis or to freeze the money of terrorist groups after 9/11.
But in its almost 50-year history, it had never once been used to create broad tariffs like this. That lack of precedent was a huge red flag for the court.
And finally, the court just did something really simple. They read the law. It lists a bunch of powers, things like block and prohibit. But you know what words are nowhere to be found? Tariff, duty, or tax? The justices basically said, come on, if Congress was going to hand over its single most important power, don't you think they would have said so? Hiding that kind of authority in the word regulate just didn't fly.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What's the big takeaway here? Why are people calling this a landmark decision, a major check on power? Well, this ruling is a powerful reminder that there are limits to a president's power, even when they declare a national emergency. It confirms that the core powers of government, like the power to tax, stay with Congress, unless Congress gives them away in an unmistakably clear language. This decision drew a very firm line in the sand.
So this ruling clarifies one very important boundary, but it leaves us with this huge, ongoing question for an age that seems to have one emergency after another. From public health to the economy, where exactly do we draw that line between a president needing to act decisively and the fundamental authority that belongs to Congress? This case answered it for tariffs, but it's a question our country is going to have to face again and again and again.